Good evening, dear participants. Welcome back to lecture number 5, to yet another thrilling lecture that's for sure is on the store for all of us. And today we have Dr. Nilanjan Chakraborty, who will be speaking on colonialism and post-colonialism. And on behalf of Team DAATH Voyage, I welcome Dr. Nilanjan. Thank you very much, Dr. Nilanjan, for accepting our invitation and being a part of this gathering. And I'm sure the participants today will be mesmerized by your scholastic ability, as has always been whenever you have been a part of this, platform. On behalf of Team DAATH Voyage, I take the honor to introduce Dr. Nilanjan Chakraborty to all of you, dear participants. Dr. Nilanjan is working presently as an assistant professor in Panchla Mahavidyalaya. He did his PhD on a very interesting topic on the use of myth in Chinua Achebe and on Amitabh Ghosh from the Department of English, Kolani University in West Bengal. And he has recently published a monograph on the same, and from Cambridge Scholars, United Kingdom, on the myth formation in the selected fiction of Chinua Achebe and Amitabh Ghosh. And today he will be speaking on a very, very pertinent, contemporary and very important topic, which we all feel very interested, very excited whenever we hear the name. And I'm sure he is here to mesmerize all of us, and we are in for a cerebral feast once again. Without wasting much time, the platform is all yours, Dr. Nilanjan.
Thank you, Dr. Shoikat Banerjee, for that wonderful introduction. So welcome to all the participants. I feel really honored to be invited by Dr. Banerjee and his very wonderful platform, the DAATH Voyage. And so today, mainly we are going to talk about colonialism and post-colonialism, with which I am rather very passionately attached to, And so today, we are going to talk about how colonialism as a narrative shapes or has already shaped our consciousness and our narratives in the past. And we will see how the different theories of colonialism and post-colonialism and how those theories are applicable to our study of literature. And then we'll try and conclude by seeing how post-colonialism as a discipline, how post-colonialism as a branch of study is still affecting us. So that will be the basic structure of my talk today. Today, I'm going to mainly concentrate on the theories. I'm not going to as much talk about the post-colonial literatures per se, because if I want to talk about the both, then obviously it will take a huge lot of time. So therefore, today I'm going to concentrate mainly on the colonialism and post-colonialism and the theoretical aspects of this particular study. So let us begin therefore. Well, now, the first thing that we need to really concentrate on, since the full screen isn't working, it seems, so therefore we'll have to work with this. So therefore, the first thing that we are going to talk about is the issue that really is very important when we are dealing with the whole idea of post-colonialism. That is the post of the post-colonialism. Now, so in the slide, you can see that I have made a couple of points over there, which is answering the dilemma, post-colonialism or post-colonialism, and how we can go about it. Now, look at this term. Now, in any theoretical study that we go for, we must understand that the lexical field of the term is something which is very important for us to really, understand. The lexical field, the lexical connotations of that particular term. Now, one dilemma that we have while we are dealing with this term post-colonialism is whether we should use a hyphen between post and colonialism, or whether we should not, or whether we should completely do away with that hyphen altogether. Now, when we are putting in the hyphen, right, when we are putting in the hyphen in the term post-colonialism, what we are doing is we are creating a certain issue of temporality around the term post-colonialism. That is something which comes after colonialism, the post of colonialism. And if we do not use the hyphen, then what we are doing is we are basically uh, using the term post-colonialism as an ideological construct, right? As an ideological field of knowledge. So when we are using the word post-colonialism, many of us would like to believe that post-colonial theory or post-colonial literatures are those literatures which are produced from the erstwhile colonies of Britain or France or Portugal. And therefore, the post-colonial literature has a certain temporal angle to it. That is, literatures which are coming out after the country achieves its independence. Now, this, if we look at it in this way, that that post-colonial literature is that literature which is coming out of the erstwhile colonies after the colonies achieved their independence, then we do understand that the temporal field itself becomes very varied, because the marker that we are using, that is the marker of independence, is not uniform across the world. So therefore, India achieves its independence in 1947, whereas other countries in Africa achieved their independence maybe 20 years later, some maybe 10 years before 1947. United States of America, for example, got its independence way back in 1789, right? So therefore, are we to say, therefore, that literatures which are being written in India from 1948 onwards are all post-colonial literatures, and therefore literatures which were written till 1947 were all colonial literatures? So that is an issue which is something that we really need to look at. So therefore, today, when we talk about post-colonialism, we actually prefer the second option, which is to completely do away with the hyphen. Because the moment you do away with the hyphen, what you are doing is you are putting the post-colonialism within a certain political space. Okay, so we are using then post-colonialism as an ideological standpoint, as an ideological perspective through which we are looking at literature, or for that matter, the critical theories as well. So therefore, the post-colonialism is a very problematic area, but we basically use post-colonialism now as an ideological term. So the post-colonialism is something which is not necessarily coming after the colonialism is over, but it is it is basically an interrogation of the colonial narrative itself. We will come to that as we go along. So moving into my next slide, rather, sorry. So the political context of post-colonialism and how we are looking at post-colonialism as a political narrative. So post-colonialism as an ideology, post-colonialism as a field of study, is coming out because of these particular political contexts. For example, decolonization. So post-colonialism is very organically linked with the very idea of decolonization. All right. So decolonization, in fact, colonization and decolonization, both, actually, if I may say. So colonization and decolonization both play a very important part in the production of the post-colonial narrative and the post-colonial politics. Now, you see the second point, prolonged efforts at resisting colonial politics and culture. You see, the thing is, now we must understand that when we are looking at the post-colonial history, in fact, when we are looking at the colonial history of any country, we understand that there is a prolonged period where the colonial hegemony is at work. Now, this colonial hegemony is at work through various institutions. The colonizer would impose the politics, through the various institutions of the colonial enterprise. For example, the state power itself. It is through the state. It is through the state that it is through the state that the colonial power would impose its politics onto the colonized. Then, of course, the economic structures. the economic structures play a very important part. The economic structures play a very important part in the imposition of the colonial politics onto the post-colonial space. For example, in India, we all know that the British came in with the intention of doing indigo trade. That was way back in the 18th century. So then they imposed various other economic measures, for example, the taxes and the way they set up the factories, the mills, and then they extracted the raw materials out of India and they fed the Industrial Revolution in England. So all those economic structures would have contributed to the economic oppression of India. Okay, so therefore the economic institutions, institutions become a very important part in the imposition of the colonial politics. Then, of course, so therefore, when this happens, and of course, I forgot that. So therefore, you have the political institutions imposing the colonial narrative. You have the economic institutions imposing the colonial narrative and the politics, and you also have the cultural institutions. Now, this cultural institutions is very, very important. Now, the place that I come from, for example, the city of Calcutta, Calcutta has always been a city which was, which was constructed as the center of the Indian colonial mission by the British. So if you come down to Calcutta, you will see there are very many buildings, schools, colleges, which were established by the British. The transport system itself, the roads, the city square, all those were built by the British so that they could construct the city as the second city of the empire after London. So therefore, it is very important that what we understand. So therefore, all those institutions, all those schools and the colleges and everything else, all those would have contributed to the cultural hegemony of the British. So therefore, the British would impose its narrative. The British would impose its structures. The British would impose its learnings through those institutions. And therefore, through the schools, for example, the English education in India would be introduced. So you have, multiple schools in Calcutta, for example, the Loreto schools, the Hindu school, the Hare school, the presidency itself, and there are so many, of course. The Calcutta University itself was one of the universities, created by the British. So therefore, they would use the schools and the colleges to impart English education onto the Indians. Why? Because they wanted the growth of a bourgeois class of Indians who would assist the British in their administrative works. All right. So therefore, through English education, through the language of English itself, they would impose. They means the British would impose the European cultural constructs onto the Indians. So they would actually make people believe that Shakespeare is actually better than, say, Kalidas. So that kind of imposition is something which is very important in the colonial history, the imposition of the colonizers' culture. This, this you can understand is very problematic, because when the British, or for that matter, any colonial enterprise, not just the British, the French, the Portuguese, everyone is doing that in every country. So when the colonizer is imposing its cultural constructs onto the colonized, what it is doing is the colonizer is actually constructing its own culture as a kind of a universal narrative. So when the British is constructing its culture, when the British is imparting its culture onto the colonized space, it is actually constructing its culture as a universal narrative, right? So therefore, the point of the British would be, the point of the colonizer would be that everything to do with the colonizer's culture has a certain universal template, TEMPLAT, template. So the colonizer therefore would look at its own culture as a universal template, and therefore that culture becomes the quote unquote standard. And this is something where the Eurocentrism kicks in. So when the colonizer is imposing its culture, when it is constructing its culture as a universal template, it is giving rise to Eurocentrism. That is Europe at the center and everything at the margins. So the colonized is at the margins. The colonizer is at the center. This center margin conflict, this center margin binary is central, is absolutely central to the Eurocentric discourses on colonialism. So Europe is positioning itself as the center, as the standard of culture, as the standard of political institutionalization, as the very center of the very consciousness of the world, maybe, and everything is at the margins. So the binary works in very typical ways, So therefore, the center is cultured, the margin is uncultured. The center is white, the margin is black. The center is Christian, the very, the very epitome of a cultured religion. The margin is non-Christian. All right. So therefore, the colonizer would try and make the colonized believe that everything which is European is great and bright, and everything which is non-European is absolutely rubbish. This center margin conflict is therefore at the heart of the colonizer-colonized dialectics. So therefore, what are the post-colonial writers trying to do? The post-colonial writers are targeting exactly this. Now, I will go into those, models where, they're talking about the adopt, adapt, edit things. I'll just come into that a bit later in say 2 or 3 minutes. But to keep it very simple, the post-colonial authors, the post-colonial intellectuals are precisely hitting at this construction of the center. They are problematizing the very construction of the center, and they're interrogating and challenging the Eurocentric perception that Europe is at the center. That's the main political, ideological, and the cultural motto of the post-colonial writers. They challenge and critique the Eurocentric politics of putting Europe at the center. That's the job of the post-colonial writers. So therefore, what they're doing is, the post-colonials, by challenging the very notion of the center, what they're doing is they are resisting the attempt to put the center at the center, and therefore the post-colonials are bringing the margin back at the center. That is something which the post-colonials are really doing as a part of their politics. They are putting the margins back at the center, and this is something which is very, very important. So therefore, the shift is from the global to the local. Now, this is something which is very interesting. If you look at the colonial discourses of Europe, right from the Enlightenment onwards, or right from the Renaissance onwards, actually, you will see that, as I said, that the Europeans are always trying to construct a certain global template of Eurocentric narratives, a global template. So if I am wearing a suit and a boot, it should be the global template for a good sense of dressing. All right. If I'm having fish and chips sitting on a table and I'm using my fork and the spoon, that should be the global template for good behavior, good eating behavior. If I'm speaking English or French or Spanish, those should be the languages of global template for universal communication. So therefore, there is a tendency in the colonial discourse to make a universalization of the Eurocentric discourses. That is something which is very important. The post-colonial authors are shifting their focus from the global to the local. They are moving back into the local. Local means they are resisting the attempts made by the Eurocentric colonial discourses to universalize Europe. So they're resisting the attempt to universalize Europe, and they're putting their they're putting their focus back onto the local history. All right, the local history, the local cultural templates, the local cultural norms. They're trying to put that back at the center. So, a post-colonial author, for example, would not say that history of India starts with the Battle of Plassey, or for that matter, the history of Bengal starts with the Battle of Plassey. No, we have a long history, long and checkered history, all right. But history does not begin with the entry of the colonizer. When, for example, Chinua Achebe, or for that matter, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, or many authors of Africa, when they are writing, they're obviously writing about the African history, which at times is pre-colonial. So that history which existed before the entry of the British, something that people will not talk about. I'll come to that. I'll come to all that. So therefore, the shift is really from the global to the local, from the universalizing tendencies of Eurocentric discourses to a local appreciation of history. And therefore, that is really the rise of the post-colonial, that marks actually the rise of the post-colonial intellectuals, writers, and artists. That is when they are shifting from the global to the local. Now, coming to my next slide, I've made a certain, timeline over here, the timeline of decolonization. That is, when are these countries becoming independent? So, go back to the issue that I was talking about. That so, if you put the hyphen in the post-colonial part, then the problem is that the year of independence for different countries are different. So it's very difficult to pinpoint as to at what precise time can you say that this is when the post-colonialism starts, because every country will have a different year of independence. So, for example, South Africa is 1910, Egypt is 22, India is 47, Burma and Sri Lanka in 48, Sudan is 56, Nigeria is 60, Kenya is 63, and you can go on making your own lists. So therefore, you see, this is a timeline of the decolonization. So what we are seeing over here is that the post-colonial history itself has a very, if I may say, it is a very varied timeline. So therefore, the timeline of post-colonialism is something which is almost impossible to pinpoint at. So that's why we are more looking at post-colonialism from a perspective of an ideological standpoint. So now, moving into the African post-colonialism, and this is where I'm going to take a bit of time and go a bit slowly and see how the issues are coming up. So these are the main writers that you are looking at. If you're looking at the, I'm sorry, there's a typo over there, of course, as you can understand, African post-colonialism. But the thing is that, you see, these are the main writers, Frantz Fanon, Thiong'o, Achebe Césaire, Wole Soyinka, Leopold Sédar Senghor. These are the main theoreticians. As I said at the beginning of my talk, that I will be concentrating mainly on the post-colonial theorists. So these are the main theorists. Now, before going into their works and how they are constructing post-colonialism, let me just hold myself back and talk about a bit about the Berlin Conference in Africa, which is a very important point of time in history when you are looking at African post-colonialism specifically. I remember that, when you're talking about modernism, for example, modernism is absolutely Eurocentric. But then when you're talking about modernism, Irfan Habib and the others would stress on the fact that there is not one modernism, but there are modernisms. So I suppose that in the study of post-colonialism, we can also say that there are many post-colonialisms, because the history of struggle is not the same for any country. So the history of struggle of Kenya or Africa, or for that matter, Nigeria, will be very different to the history of struggle for independence of India, right? So therefore, because we have different histories and different cultures, so therefore, it's unfair to say that that there is only one model of post-colonialism. Every post-colonial discourse, every post-colonial struggle against colonial hegemony would actually be different, and it depends on the geographical and the national boundaries that you're looking at, which constructs the very idea of post-colonialism. Now, this Berlin Conference on Africa is a very important conference that we need to look at while we are dealing with the African post-colonial discourse. Why is it important? Because this Berlin Conference was held in Berlin, as you can understand from the name. It was held from the year 1884 to 1885. So therefore, it was basically a conference, that went on for, I think, 9 or 10 months. Now, what was the conference all about? It's very interesting. You see, these colonial powers who had entered Africa. Now, in Africa, there were quite a few European colonial powers who had entered: Britain, Spain, France, even Portugal. So quite a few colonial powers had entered Africa. Now, what they did was this: that in the Berlin Conference, they basically talked about how can they divide the African continent between themselves. Just look at the audacity of this conference. Here are the colonizers who are not even a part of Africa. They are not the natives of Africa. They're the outsiders. They're the colonial powers, and they are deciding among themselves how can they divide the African continent among themselves without even consulting with the Africans whether they want to be part of that colony or not. So you can understand the tremendous amount of political violence which is associated with this remapping of Africa, as it were, with this, with this restructuring of the African space altogether. That is something which is very important, right? So this was basically a conference which was there for the remapping of Africa as a possession of the colonial powers. Now, why were they so interested in Africa? Were they really going for a philanthropic job? As Rudyard Kipling will be saying, the white man's burden? Well, no. They were basically going to Africa to establish a free trade among themselves. And this free trade took the form of slavery later on as well. So basically, they wanted the diamonds out of Africa. They wanted the spices out of Africa. And so therefore, in order to claim, those wealth, the European powers basically divided Africa among themselves so that they can establish the free trade among them. So therefore, this is something which is very important. This is what from here we will move into Fano. So therefore, you can understand that the history of colonization is very intricately linked with the very idea, with the very reality of economic possession of the other. So this is something which is very, very important. So the political colonization is kind of has a prelude to it, and the prelude is the economic colonization. And that's why I said that even in India, if you look at the history of colonization, the British mainly came as indigo traders, and then we all know what they did. So therefore, the history of colonization starts with the history of economic possession, history of economic colonization. That's what the Berlin Conference was trying to do, to divide the African continent among the colonial powers so that they possess the different parts of Africa among themselves in order to establish their free trade. And The colonized were never even consulted. This is what we call the silencing of the other. The other is in any case silenced. So this was the result of the Berlin Conference. There are two maps which I have given you. So these are the two maps. Why are we talking about these two maps? Because you see on the left you have Africa in the 1880s. So if you look at the map in the left, I don't know whether I can just yeah. So I have just zoomed that a bit. So therefore, you see, if you look at the map in the left, 1880, you will see that Egypt was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. That's why it is written as OT over there. And Algeria was, I think, already ruled by France. But apart from Egypt and Algeria, the rest of the African continent, the large white parts and the little green and the blue parts that you can see, they were basically, local kingdoms. Okay, local kingdoms, especially the large white part that you see right throughout the continent. They are basically the local kingdoms which are ruling themselves. After the Berlin Conference is over, in 1913, you can see that how Africa is divided between the various European powers. So therefore, the pink part, the pink part that you can see on the northeastern part of Africa and the southern part of Africa, in the western coast as well, that those pink parts would be ruled by United Kingdom. The blue parts, the large blue portion that you see in the northwestern part of Africa was ruled by France. The green one would be Portugal. The yellow one would be Spain. The brownish would be Italy. Then the gray ones, the three large gray parts that you can see, would be ruled by Germany. And not the pink part, but what do you call it? Violet, maybe, which is right there in the center in the Congo basin. That was, of course, ruled by Belgium. All right. And the yellow part is by Ethiopia, and the blue and the sky blue part by Liberia. So what you can see is that this entire African continent, which is a huge continent, it's a massive continent, that entire continent gets divided between the various European powers to establish free trade among themselves. Right. So by 1913, you have a very strong establishment of the European colonies in Africa. And where was it decided? Well, ironically, it was decided in one of the colonial centers in Belgium. So this is something which is incredibly interesting. Okay, so having noted all these things, let's move into an author whom we really need to talk a bit about, because he is so important. So let me move into Frantz Fanon now. And Frantz Fanon is one of the most, important theoreticians coming out of the world of African post-colonialism. All right, so Frantz Fanon's most important work is Wretched of the Earth. All right, Wretched of the Earth. And this Wretched of the Earth, Fanon, by the way, comes from the Francophone part of Africa. So he is writing his text, Wretched of the Earth, in French. And since I at least don't know French, I have read him in English. Interestingly, the preface to this book, Wretched of the Earth, was written by Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, I'll just talk about a bit about Fanon over here, because I believe that Fanon is somebody whom we really, really need to know. Now, Frantz Fanon is a writer, is a post-colonial writer, a post-colonial theoretician who is heavily influenced by the Marxist principles. He is a Marxist post-colonial. And that's why when Fanon is talking about the history of colonization in Europe, he is basically interlinking the history of colonization with the history of economic exploitation. And therefore, Fanon's model of understanding post-colonialism is about resisting the template of economic oppression of the bourgeois colonialists, which continues even after the colonial period is over. I'll come to that during the end part of my discussion on Frantz Fanon. Now, so therefore, Frantz Fanon says this, and I'm quoting him: "The colonial world is a world cut into two. The dividing line, the frontiers, are shown by barracks and police stations. In the colonies, it is the policeman and the soldier who are the official instituted go-betweens, the spokesmen of the settler and his rule of oppression. In capitalist societies, the educational system, whether lay or clerical, the structure of moral reflexes handed down from father to son, the exemplary honesty of workers who are given a medal after 50 years of good and loyal service." So therefore, Fanon's idea is, this is a chapter which he calls concerning violence. So therefore, Fanon is of the point of view that the colonial discourse is basically a discourse of violence. And this violence is both physical and ideological, much like what Althusser will be talking about the ISA and the RSA. So therefore, Fanon is of the point of view that, colonialism as a discourse, colonialism as a narrative is indeed a narrative of violence, and this violence is perpetrated to the police, the military, the colonial police, and the colonial military. But at the same time, the violence which is inflicted through colonialism is also ideological, and this violence, the ideological violence, is done mainly to the imposition of the colonizer's culture over the culture of the colonized. So therefore, if you look at, for example, a seminal novel by Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart, if you read that novel, you will see that in that particular novel, the British officials who are coming, people in Good Country and the others who are coming into Nigeria, the first thing that they do is they establish a church and they convert the people into Christianity, so that when the natives are brought into the fold of the church, they are basically brought into the fold of the colonial discourse. And then they are taught about the British history, they're taught about the British literatures, they're taught about the British etiquettes, and then the natives are basically appropriated into the belief that the native culture is indeed inferior as compared to the colonizer's culture. So this violence concerns the ideological imposition of the colonizer as well. So there's another thing that there's a lot more things that Fanon says, but I'm just sort of picking out the most important points, as it were. Now, Fanon therefore is saying that one of the most important shifts that happened from the pre-colonial period to the post-colonial period is, or let's say from the pre-colonial period to the colonial period, is that in the pre-colonial period there is a pre-capitalist society. But when the colonizer comes in with the capitalist economic system, the imposition of the bourgeois over those who do not have the capital, right? So therefore, Fanon's point is that the history of colonization is indeed a history of capitalist intervention, and therefore, Fanon is identifying the colonial mission as indeed as a capitalist mission. Okay, it is a capitalist mission. Therefore, Fanon goes on to say that when the post-colonial so this is what he says, and I just want to quote this. I'm just quoting Fan over here. The colonialist bourgeois, in its narcissistic dialogue expounded by the members of its universities, had in fact deeply implanted in the minds of the colonized intellectual that the essential qualities remain eternal in spite of all the blunders men may make. The essential qualities of the West, of course. So therefore, through the through the universities, through the colleges, the colonized intellectual is appropriated into the belief, is appropriated into the discourse that that the colonial intervention, the colonial spirit, the colonial narrative is indeed something which is superior as compared to the, to the colonized dialogues. So this is something which the West is doing. So therefore, the West is essentially imposing itself as a capitalist power. And why capitalist power? This is something which is also very important, because you see, the colonizers are mainly taking over the economic models. They are mainly taking over the economic structures of the society, and that is something which is very important. So therefore, the economic structures, the economic, the economic structures of the society, the economic, the economic institutions of the colonized country, they're all being taken over by the colonizer. So the colonizer is using all the capital in order to take over the colonizer's institutions. That is how the colonizer becomes a capitalist force, which is which is taking over the economic institutions of the colonized country. So therefore, Fano is of the point of view, just 1 second. Yeah, sorry. So therefore, you see the colonized. So therefore, you see the main point that Frantz Fanon is saying is that since the colonizer is taking over the colonized space as a capitalist force, therefore, the problem is that during the process of decolonization, this structure of the capitalist oppression remains. That is, after the decolonization is over and after the British have gone back to their country, the new nation state which is established, that the new post-colonial nation state which is established, has the bourgeois in place. That is, those classes of people who are economically rich and those classes of people who have a control over the capital of the country, they now become the new bourgeois who are ruling the country. All right, and therefore the post-colonial political class, and this is something that Fanon is saying in context to the African nations, the post-colonial bourgeois politicians are incredibly corrupt. They're corrupt because they have an absolute control over the capital of the country. And so therefore that whole structure of the bourgeois capitalists working as the oppressive class and the proletariat still remaining as the oppressed class, this structure remains even after the decolonization is over. So therefore these corrupt politicians, economically and otherwise corrupt politicians, they still have the bourgeois nation state under their control. So decolonization naturally does not mean that the oppressed is now suddenly liberated. That is not something which happens. And you can in this particular context, you can refer to a novel like, say, what was that? No Longer at Ease by Chinua Achebe. In No Longer at Ease, Chinua Achebe is talking about precisely this issue and how the bourgeois capitalist class remains after the decolonization, and they now become the new voice of the bourgeois oppression. This is something that you get in a novel like, as I said, No Longer at Ease, and even in the works of Ngugi wa Thiong'o and all, you will find that very much. Okay. So therefore, Fanon is of the point of view, and there is another chapter in this book which is very important. And in fact, two different chapters which are actually important. One is the pitfalls of national consciousness, and the other chapter is on national culture. So on national culture, Fanon writes, and I will just quote over here. This is from On National Culture. This is what Fanon writes. The past is given back its value. Culture extracted from the past to be displayed in all its splendor is not necessarily that of his own country. Interesting. So you see, Fanon is, when he is talking about post-colonialism, he is saying that the post-colonial writers should be very aware as to which part of the history has been imposed upon or has been constructed by the colonialists, and which part of the history is indeed native. That is something which is very, very important. For example, if I may give a very Calcutta centric example, if you come down to Calcutta, I'm sure you will see a lot of sweet shops, but the sweets that the Bengalis love and claim to be a part of their own cultural heritage, well, they don't know that the cottage cheese was actually introduced in Calcutta by the Europeans. We did not have the concept of the cottage cheese, say, prior to the 18th century. So now, the cottage cheese sweets are a part of the Bengali heritage and this and that, but all that was a part of the colonialist cultural heritage. So therefore, this is exactly what Fanon is trying to say, that a post-colonial writer should be very aware as to which part of the history is colonially intervened and which part of the history is kind of native. Again, it's very difficult to separate or segregate the two, but, well, attempts should be made. This is what he says. So, the last chapter of Fanon is very, very interesting. The last chapter of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth is called Colonial War and Mental Disorders. And this is one chapter that Fanon constructs as a psychoanalyst. And in this particular chapter, what Fanon is doing is, he is basically showing how the post-colonial population is negotiating with the trauma of the colonial oppression, the trauma of the colonial torture. And in this, of course, Fanon is quite heavily influenced by the Freudian psychoanalysis and the Freudian psychoanalytical models. I'll just read a little part. This is just 10 to 12 lines, but just look at this. So this section is titled as Verbal Stereotype. And this is what Fanon is writing. I'm quoting him. The patient continually repeats sentences of the type of, I didn't tell anything, or I didn't tell them anything. You must believe me, I didn't talk. Such stereotypes are accompanied by a permanent anxiety state. In fact, the patient does not even know whether he has given any information away. The sense of culpability towards the cause he was fighting for and his brothers in arms whose names and addresses he may have given here weighs so heavily as to be dramatic. So therefore, there's a patient who continuously says, I didn't tell them anything. Why does he continuously say this? Because he must have been tortured by the colonial police officers who would have tortured him. And then, continuously the patient goes on saying, oh, I didn't tell them anything, please. I didn't tell them anything. So this is a kind of a post-colonial anxiety, a post-colonial trauma that remains with the population or a part of the population who have grappled with the torture and the physical abuse of the colonial powers. So I think that this chapter therefore becomes very important as well. So therefore, what we do understand is that Fanon's main argument is that since the colonial mission is indeed a mission of capitalist oppression. So therefore, it is very important for any post-colonial writer and thinker to be aware of the economic institutions through which the colonialists would have oppressed the colonized. And so therefore, the entire bourgeois structure of the state remains even after the decolonization is over. And so therefore, like a true blue Marxist, Fanon is looking at the state as a bourgeois enterprise of oppression. And this is something which starts off during the colonial history, and it continues even in the post-colonial times. And so therefore, the struggle of the people, the struggle of the common people, is basically to dismantle this bourgeois structure of oppression, which takes the form of a state as far as Fanon is concerned. Okay. So if I may just move to the next slide. So these are some of the quotes, that you have. So you can just have a look at that. For the colonized people, for example, Fanon says, the most essential value because the most concrete is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity. So therefore, land becomes a very important issue in the post-colonial discourse. Whose land is it, and who is taking hold of the land? And secondly, of course, there's another quote that perhaps we haven't sufficiently demonstrated that colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding up people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form of content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. This work of devaluing pre-colonial history takes on a dialectical significance today. This is something which is a kind of an umbrella-like issue in every post-colonial theory, the question of history. Because we all know that history is produced by and through power. History is essentially a narrative produced by power. So therefore, when the colonialists are writing the history of the colonized space, they're basically devaluing the pre-colonial history. And this was very much the case with Africa. You know why? Because Africa, before the British came in, was primarily a tribal society. Of course, in fact, the very idea of the African is very problematic. It is as problematic as the very idea of the Indian, right? Because this whole question of stereotypifying through a macro narrative is very problematic. So what is Indian is something which is incredibly problematic. So what is African is also incredibly problematic, because in Africa you have more than 1,600 dialects being spoken and languages. And there are so many countries, so many different types of political institutions, different types of cultural history, different languages, different food habits. So the culture in Africa is as varied as it can always be, So therefore, the very idea of African is very problematic. But so therefore, you see, history therefore becomes a site of control. SIT is site, right? History always is a site of control between the different powers. So when the British, and for that matter, when the other European colonialists, when they entered Africa, they looked at the African pre-colonial history as something which is not even worth telling, because they felt that the African tribal society is something which is in any case unimportant. That was the colonialist mentality, the colonialist perspective. And so therefore they want us to believe still perhaps that the African history starts with the entry of the European colonialists in Africa. But then Fanon is of the point of view that a post-colonial historian, when he is working in Africa, or when he is working with African history, a post-colonial historian must always take a lot of importance. The post-colonial historian must give a lot of importance to the pre-colonial history, so that the pre-colonial history comes across as a dominant narrative. And in that way, the past of Africa can be constructed properly, rather than through the power lens of colonialism. Okay, so let's move a bit further because otherwise we will never end, as it were. So this is the next text that I'm moving into, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, which was published in the year 1986. Now, the politics of Fano and the politics of Ngugi are a bit different to each other in the sense that Fano is mainly talking about the colonial history and how the colonial history constructs the bourgeois class and how it is oppressing and silencing the pre-colonial history, all that through the Marxist lens. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's politics is to look at the African history or to look at the history of African post-colonialism through a more literary point of view, through a more literary angle. This particular book, Decolonizing the Mind, as you can see, was published in 1986. And this particular book actually to me is more interesting than Fano. Not that I have anything against Fano, but because I am a man of literature. In fact, all of you are, I guess. So therefore, Ngugi wa Thiong'o over here mainly talks about the issue of language. Because the next point, as you can see, is communication creates culture. So communication is a site of struggle for post-colonial referentiality. So you see, the point is that communication creates culture. It is communication that creates culture. Literary communication, linguistic communication, different forms of communication that you can talk about. All those communications construct culture. So therefore, if you're looking at constructing post-colonial culture, then the communication will have to be spot on. Now, what does it mean by this? Now, the first issue that Ngugi wa Thiong'o basically tackles is the issue of language itself. That is, in which language should the post-colonial authors write it? Now, I'm going to punch this with some essays of Chinua Achebe as well. Chinua Achebe also, for example, in essays like The African Writers and the English Language, delves into the same question. That is, in which language should be that? Now, this is a very, very important question, a very basic question, which requires no critical bent of mind, which requires no sophisticated study of post-colonial theories. The question is, should we write in English? And if we write in English, then the next question is, why should we write in English? Because English is not our language. I mean, the basic question that we have to raise, isn't it? Why should India continue with the English departments? If you're in Bengal, read Bengali literature. If you're in Maharashtra, read Marathi literature. Why should you have to read English literature? Because English is a part of the colonial history. It's a part of the colonial hegemony. And so therefore, we are just continuing with the colonial hegemony by reading in English. This is a very, a very pedantic way of looking at the thing, as you can understand. And if you remember, Raja Rao also, referred to this question in the preface to Kantapura. So, you see, Ngugi wa Thiong'o is of the point of view that language is a marker of culture. I'll just quote what Ngugi says over here. Culture is almost indistinguishable from the language that makes possible its genesis, growth, banking, articulation, and indeed its transmission from one generation to the next. So therefore, culture as a mode of transmission is something which is done through language. So therefore, the question is, why should the Africans continue to write in English? Now, this question is addressed by Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and they're saying that English is something which the post-colonial intellectuals have received from their colonial education. Because if you look at these people, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe, and the others, they are all products of the colonial education. They have read in English medium schools. Just like if you look at the 19th century Bengali intellectuals, from Raja Ram Mohan Roy to Bankim Chandra to Rabindranath to Vivekananda, to everyone, they have all read in English medium schools. So the problem is that when the post-colonial writers, the first generation post-colonial writers, when they are resisting the centrality of the Eurocentric discourses, their language naturally becomes English because they are trained in the English language. So they are using English as a tool of subversion. This is what Ngugi's point is, that the post-colonial thinkers are using English as a tool of subversion. They are using English to write back at the empire if we are using Bilashcroft. I'll come to Bilashcroft in some time. So therefore, the point therefore is that English therefore is used as a tool of subversion, and therefore English becomes a political mode of communication through which the post-colonial authors and writers and intellectuals and thinkers are resisting the centrality of the Eurocentric discourse. They cannot help but write in English because they have been appropriated into the colonizers' language through their colonial education. So therefore, this is what he says, that imperialism therefore is a cultural bomb. It's a cultural bomb. It sort of blasts itself into some kind of hegemony. So therefore, language, he says, as Ngugi says over here, that language as culture is thus mediating between me and my own self, between my own self and other selves, between me and nature. Language is mediating in my very being. So therefore, the transmission of culture, since it is done through language, so therefore language becomes a tool of subversion for the post-colonial writers, because they are using the power of language to subvert the Eurocentric discourses. And that is why, if you, I don't know whether you know this, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, 15 years back, he stopped writing in English, and he was writing only in Gikuyu, which is his native language. But then he has come back to English as well. But Chinua Achebe says this also in that particular essay, the English language, the African writers and the English language. He says over there that English language is a natural tool of communication to these post-colonial writers. So therefore, they cannot do anything but to write in English. So therefore, English therefore becomes a language of expression, a language of mediation, a language of counteracting the cultural hegemony of the British. And so therefore, the language of the African literature is not the English language that's say, for example, Dickens would be using or Austen would be using. So the African English would have a very distinct flavor of its own. And you will understand that the moment you begin to read these novels or short stories, the moment you begin to read Achebe, Thiong'o, Emma Ata Aidu, and the others, you will see that the kind of English that they are using is very different to the kind of English that you have read in Dickens, because they are mixing a local cultural flavor into that English language. So it distinctly becomes an African English. So just like we have British English, we have Indian English, we have American English, we also have African English. And that African English is very, very localized in its content, in the way it is reflecting on the issues of Africa. So that's how it is. Moving into the next slide, these are some of the very important essays of Chinua Achebe. The first essay, I'm sure many of you would have already read this, because this is a highly recommended essay at the MA in any universities, where Achibe is talking about the racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness and how Conrad is racially stereotypifying Africa as the heart of darkness. So Africa is the atavistic, very Dionysiac, very dark kind of a space where one moves into the unconscious age the moment one enters into Africa. That kind of a very, very stereotyped politics of producing Africa as the very heart of darkness is something that actually is talking about at length in that essay. And then there are these essays which you should read. I'm sure you will get more details once you read those essays. So the next essays that we are moving into is Edward Said's Orientalism. This is something which is very important, and I'm sure many of you would have already read this. But Edward Said's Orientalism, published in 1978, argued that the very production of the image of the Orient is produced by the Occident, is produced by the West. So when we are looking at the very image of the Orient with the magical spices over there, and people are basically snake charmers, and we have the magical carpets which are flying around, and a very colorful, exotic kind of a location that the Orient is. Basically, Edward Said is concentrating on the image of the Arab world as constructed by the West. So therefore, Edward Said basically says that the Orient therefore is politically and epistemologically, that is through language, produced by the West. So in post-colonial space, in post-colonial narratives, no knowledge is innocent. Every knowledge is political. Every knowledge is political, because every knowledge about the other is produced by Europe. So when you're looking at the Orient, the exotic, mystical idea of the Orient, it is being produced by the Eurocentric narratives. Think about, for example, a very famous short story which every one of us are acquainted with, James Joyce's Araby. The very connection with the Araby that the boy has, is basically centered around the mystical idea of the Arab. So therefore, the boy thinks that, oh my God, Mangan's sister has asked me to bring something from the market, so therefore let me bring it, and therefore he goes on a quest and all that we all know about. But just look at the use of the word bazaar in the text. James Joyce could have used the word market, but he uses the word bazaar, the Persian word, in order to exoticize Araby. So therefore, there's a politics of exoticization going on as far as the Araby is concerned, because the Araby is the center of the boy's consciousness, because he is interlinking the mystery of Mangan's sister with the mystery of Araby. So that's how the West is producing the Orient as an exotic, mystical location. If you, for example, since the CBSE syllabus has allowed us to talk about these things in the classes as well, if you look at, for example, some of the comic strips of Tintin, because that is one comics that we all love, I'm sure. So if you go to Tintin and if you see Tintin's travel towards the Arab world, I don't know which comic strip it was, but you will see that there's a large comic strip over there, separated by a gutter from the other comic strips. And then in that particular strip, you will see that you have the typical image of the Arab world: the snake charmers, the spices, the color all around, and of course the flying carpets. And Tintin is not even scandalized by this sight, because Tintin thinks that it is normal that you will find these flying carpets in the Arab world. So Hajj is producing an exotic image of the Orient, almost an impossible image of the Orient. I'm sure Arab is as boring a place as we all know it to be, just like our own places are as boring and as ordinary as they are. So therefore, but then you see Hajj as that as the European, as the Eurocentric writer is producing the image of the Oriental, of the Orient as something which is exotic. So therefore, in fact, what Rudyard Kipling had said, that East is West, East is East, and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. So therefore, this binarization, this exoticization of the other, this mystifying the other, is a part of the political process of orientalizing the other, which is of course done by the Europeans. So these are the three connotations of the term that of course Edward Said wants you to look at. So there is an academic tradition through which the Orient is produced. Academic tradition in the sense that, you know, there have been so-called scholars, not real scholars, but so-called scholars, pseudo scholars, who have tried to prove academically that indeed Arab is indeed a world of exotic charms and stuff like that. Just like we have the Indologists of the 19th century, you know, their headquarters was the Asiatic Society in Calcutta, which is right there on the crossing of the Park Street. So so you have the academic tradition, you know, which is orientalizing the other, as it were. And then an epistemological binary is created, you know, a binary through language, which is created between the West and the Orient as a worldview. And of course, the political instrument and the representational instrument of domination. So the political institutions of Europe have all contributed to this politics of orientalizing the other. The next book that not many people talk about when they are talking about post-colonialism, well, you see, this is a book by David Mignolo. In fact, two books I have referred to over here. These two books are very interesting books, and if you do get a chance, please read them. One is, of course, The Darker Side of the Renaissance, and the other one is The Darker Side of Western Modernity. And here, David Mignolo is basically arguing about these things. The de-Westernization, for example, irreversible shift to the east over struggles of power, knowledge, and politics. Okay, so therefore, you know, so what is Mignolo arguing? Mignolo is arguing that this whole tradition, this whole epistemological, political, ideological tradition of othering the non-European spaces starts with the Renaissance. Because it is really during the Renaissance, during the 15th century, that the Europeans, remember, had started the great mission of navigation. And so therefore they were navigating to discover the new worlds. The very idea of discovery, therefore, is very political, because it is Europe discovering that place. And therefore the political implication of that is that with the discovery of the place, with Europe discovering that place comes into existence. So that's the Eurocentric narrative, that's the colonialist interpretation of history that you have, right? So therefore, with the entry of the colonial fathers, you have the beginning of the history of that particular place. So therefore, America's history starts with the entry of Britain. The African history starts with the entry of Europeans, which is incredibly problematic, as you can understand, because when we were having the Indus Valley civilization, and when we were having the pyramids in Egypt, and when we were having the Inca civilization in South America, the Europeans were basically living on the trees. Okay, so this is the colonialist interpretation of history, and how they are looking at history as something which is beginning with the entry of the colonial mission into those particular spaces. This is something which is incredibly problematic, as you can understand. And you know, in America, for example, the British had killed almost around 250,000 Native Americans, because they felt that the silencing of the other is important. In fact, the other does not even exist. So therefore, in order to impose the power of the colonial politics, you know, they exterminated 250,000 Native Americans, which is not even close, which is far, far, far more than the number of people that Hitler killed. In fact, the killing of the Native Americans are known as the largest human genocide in the history of mankind. You know, so therefore, the Renaissance therefore produced this shift towards the struggle of power, knowledge, and politics, which produced the colonial mission, which produced the colonial structure of power. So therefore, decoloniality is essentially the process of delinking from the Western matrix of power. This is something that David Miglolo is basically arguing in these two books, right? So therefore, there is a role that semiotics plays, cartography, language, ideology, all these play a very important part in the process of decoloniality, because it is through decoloniality that one can delink one's self from the Western matrix of power, and that is important in every post-colonial discourse. This is something that M. Sezier writes, a discourse on colonialism, and this was published in 1950. And M. Sezier is also a part of the Francophone, African tradition, and he is also writing in French. Just a little anecdote, M. Sezier has written a wonderful play called Une Tempête, which is a wonderful subversion of the colonial oppression represented by adapting Shakespeare's The Tempest. So the name of the play is Une Tempête, U-N-E, then T-E-M-P-E-T-E. Okay, so this particular book, Discourse on Colonialism, this was published in 1950. And therefore, M. Sezier, like Frantz Fanon, is also a Marxist post-colonial thinker. And he is of the point of view that the European hegemony is indefensible. So European hegemony is something which cannot be defended, and therefore European hegemony will have to be thrown out by the proletariat revolution. And he says that colonization imposed hateful solutions on people. That is, hateful solutions in the sense that colonization, forced people into believing in the European discourses of power. So therefore, in fact, like Frantz Fanon, M. Sezier is also talking about the white supremacist ideology. And he is saying that the native bourgeois are the watchdogs of colonialism. This is a very interesting quote. So like Frantz Fanon, M. Sezier is also of the point of view that the bourgeois, that is after the process of decolonization is over, after the country has achieved its independence, the bourgeois class of that new nation state are the watchdogs of colonialism. That is, they continue with the same structures of power, they continue with the same politics of oppression, like their British predecessors used to do. So therefore, a country becoming independent does not necessarily dismantle the bourgeois structures of oppression. That has to be done through a proletariat revolution. So this is something that M. Sezier is saying, right? So through a proletariat revolution, the country can achieve a truly post-colonial identity whereby the structures of bourgeois oppressions are dismantled. Otherwise, things really do not change because the bourgeois class remains as oppressive as their British predecessors are. I've come to the end of the Australian post-colonialism, but just as a little anecdote before I move on to the next section very quickly. This is a little anecdote that I always tell to my students, and I will tell over here as well, because this is a wonderful essay that Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes, and it's called Black Skin, White Masks. In that particular essay, Black Skin, White Masks, Ngugi wa Thiong'o says that, once, and I'm talking basically on the issue of language and colonial politics. So you see, one day, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he enters into a classroom of boys who are studying in class 3 or 4. Okay. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o asks the boys to name some flowers. And to the dismay and to the disgust of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he finds out that the boys are able to name the flowers which they have never seen in their life. Flowers like lily, daffodils, primrose, musk rose, etc., etc. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o notes that, you see, this is how the language of colonial oppression works. The boys are able to name those flowers because they have encountered the names of those flowers in the English romantic poets. They have read Wordsworth, they have read Shelley, they have read Keats, and so therefore they know about the primrose and whatever. But flowers which they have no experience of, they have never seen those flowers. Whereas the flowers that they see on the roadside every day while coming from the home to the school, they're not able to name them. So therefore, you see, this is the way in which the colonialist discourses create a kind of an epistemological gap in the colonized space. So the colonized space becomes epistemologically blank, whereas the colonizer is imposing his language and culture onto the colonized through the institutions of education. So this is a dangerous trend, according to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and I think this is something which is a very practical way of looking at things. And I suppose in India, things are not very different either, you know. So that's how it is. Now, moving into the Australian post-colonialism, before I move into the Indian post-colonialism, this is a history of shame. I know I have titled this slide as the history of shame, because the British had entered Australia and they regarded Australia as a penal colony, penal, P-E-N-A-L, penal colony. That is a colony where they dumped their criminals. You know, if you go to that novel by Dickens, Great Expectations, Magwitch, who is the protector of the boy, Pip, he is a criminal and he is dumped into Australia. So that's how Australia was treated by the British as a penal colony. So this is the history of shame that we are talking about. The British entered Australia in 1788, and about 250,000 Aborigines were present. But by 1920, so you see, in a gap of around how many 20 plus 10, 30, 130 years, by 1920, not more than 60,000 were present. So therefore, almost almost 2 lakh Aborigines were killed in a gap of around 130 years. And you see, this is the history of the mass massacres: the Appin massacre, the Minamura River massacre, the Bathurst massacre, the Mount Dispersion massacre, the Mile Creek massacre. You know, I've given you a small list. If you go into the history of Australia, you will find that these massacres went on, and you can make a list of 100 massacres. So, but the point that you really have to take into consideration is that the British killed more than 2 lakh Australian Aborigines in a matter of 130 years. The same thing that they did in America as well. So this is an extermination of the colonized space, an extermination of the natives. That's why if you look at the Australian Aboriginal poets now, poets like Udjeru, Mudruru, if you look at those poets, they will talk about these histories of massacre in their poetry. This is what it is. This is, of course, a very, very important text, a seminal text that we read while doing post-colonial studies. So you have The Empire Rides Back, which was written by Bill Ashcroft and Russell Tiffin. And, I'm just moving to the next one because I'm really pressed for time, it seems now. So therefore, in The Empire Rides Back, what he says is what Bill Ashcroft is arguing is that institutionalization and subsequent valorization of the English literary study to a shape and an ideological context developed in the colonial context. And he's talking about the mimicry. So I'm basically trying to explain this to you in very simple terms. So therefore, in Empire Rides Back, Bill Ashcroft says that there are 3 stages to post-colonial writings. Okay, there are 3 stages to post-colonial writings when a colonized subject is writing in the post-colonial times. or in the colonial times. So what are the three stages of literary development? He says adopt, 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 then adapt, ADAPT, and then adept, ADEPT. So, well, Bill Ashcroft would argue that, you know, when a post-colonial, or let's say when a native is trying to write in the colonial space, the first thing that the native writer would do is to adopt the Western models. Why should he at all adopt the Western models? Because remember that most of the post-colonial intellectuals are British educated or colonially educated, you know. So therefore, they are trained to think and write like the Europeans. So therefore, they will first of all adopt the Western literary model. For example, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay adopted the Western model of the novel and wrote Raj Mohan's Wife, which is considered to be the first Indian novel in English. So that's what it is. You know, Achebe is writing a novel. Ngugi is writing a novel. Ama Ata Aidoo is writing a novel. And novel is not an African literary form. It's a Western literary form, which the writers are adopting for their subversive politics. So that's the first stage, adopting. Then adapting, you know, so the author will have to adapt to the Western models of writing. And finally, there is adapting. That is, the writer now makes a new model. He constructs a new model, which is not like the Western literary form, but which has a distinctly native form in its representation. So when you are reading, for example, Achibe's novels, they don't read like the novels of Dickens. When you're reading the novel of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, like The River in Between, the river in between will not read like Jane Austen, or it will not read like James Joyce or Virginia Woolf, because it has a distinct African flavor to it, culturally African, linguistically African, ideologically African. So therefore, adapting is a way in which the Western literary form is subverted to meet the requirements of the native literature. Okay. So therefore, if you're just looking at this, so therefore, you know, hegemony. So this is one word that, you know, Bill Ashcroft comes back quite frequently in this particular theory. The empire rides back. And, you know, so therefore, well, he is of the point of view, I mean, you know, Ashcroft is of the point of view that the margin, by adapting to the Western literary model and then subverting it to suit his own ideological and political needs, is basically writing back at the empire. So the empire has given him a certain model to work it. He subverts that model and then writes back at the empire by subverting that model which has been given to him by the empire. So this subversion is essentially a tool of resistance, right? So the margin is writing back, and the British texts which constructed the truth and the absolute it is questioned. And the very question of place and displacement, therefore, is important, because reconstruction of the place, the gap between place and experience, the meaning of language, and the cultural denigration of questions of indigenous cultures and literature, which basically means that post-colonial literature reconstructs the question of the literary place. That is, the literature that the post-colonial writer is producing, you know, the literary space that he is producing is not the space of the colonizer, but it is indeed a space of, you know, it is indeed a space of the subverted space of the colonized narrative. Okay, so now moving into the next portion, I hope I'm, you know, I can keep some time for question and answers, which I must. So therefore, I'm trying to rush through this. So the Indian post-colonialism, is indeed a very, very interesting part, because it's closer to our experience. And I have, you know, listed down a timeline of the Bengal Renaissance, the so-called Bengal Renaissance. There is obviously a lot of debate among the Bengal intellectuals as to whether we can call this a Renaissance at all. But well, accepting that it is a Renaissance. So therefore, why am I talking about the Bengal Renaissance? Because it is the Bengali intellectuals of the 19th century who are writing back at the empire by subverting the European political, literary, and the cultural modes of representation. So, I really do not know much about the Indian writings which are happening in the 19th century in English outside Bengal. I'm sorry, but I'm not really aware of them because I don't specialize in that area. So therefore, I have made a timeline of those incidents which I think is very important for the Bengal Renaissance, and these incidents are very important because these incidents are contributing to the post-colonial subversion of writing back at the empire. How? You see, Raja Ram Mohan Roy is leading, of course, the movement of the writing back. Now, in 1861, the Brahmo Samaj was founded by Pandit Nabin Chandra Roy in a particular session in Lahore. Now, this Brahmo Samaj has a huge contribution in interfusing the Western and the Indian modes of thinking, because the Samaj encouraged rational, critical, and scientific thinking. Now, remember that the members of the Samaj, the Brahmo Samaj, they were all Western educated intellectuals. So, we were talking about adopt, adapt, and adapt. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy and the others are adopting the Western models of thinking. They are adopting the Western ideological constructs in order to make the Indian thinking, or let's say the Indian post-colonial space, as rational. Now, does that mean that they agree to the fact that the Indians are basically irrationals? No. What they're basically saying is that the 19th century is a time in Bengal where there was a lot of superstitions which crept into religion, especially the Hindu religion and definitely Islam as well. But then they were not talking about Islam, they were talking mainly about the Hindu religion. And they were saying that unless and until Hindu religion is revived, the pre-colonial glory of India cannot be reinstated. So therefore, they felt that they needed a new philosophical system through which the Hindu religion will be given a more critical and rational outlook. For this, they had established the Brahmo Samaj. Rabindranath was a member of the Brahmo Samaj, remember, but then later he came out of that. In fact, the entire Tagore family were Brahmos. The great Satyajit Ray was a Brahmo. Okay, so therefore the Brahmos are basically looking at Indian history from the perspective of rational intellect, rather than going into the superstitions. Okay, so in 1800, the Baptist mission is established in Srirampur, which is spreading the education among the girls, among the boys. And the Hindu school was established in 1817, which is the oldest modern educational institute in Asia. This, of course, later became the Presidency College, and now, of course, it is the Presidency University. In 1857, the University of Calcutta is established, which is the first of the 4 modern universities in India. And in 1777, we have the establishment of the printing press in Calcutta by James Augustus Hickey, and in Srirampur by Nathaniel Grassley, Halhead, and Charles Wilkins. All these are very important because this, all this, that is the establishment of the Baptist mission, the establishment of the Brahmo Samaj, the Hindu school, the presidency, the University of Calcutta, the printing press itself, all this encouraged a movement towards a printing culture, and all these incidents encouraged a movement towards a critical and a rational rethinking of history. And that is something which is contributing to the East-West synergy, the East-West synchronization of the Bengali intellectuals in the 19th century. And through this rational interpretation of history, these intellectuals are able to create a space, they are able to create a space where they are, where they are able to kind of look at history from a more rational perspective, which is of course contributing to the post-colonial discourse. So these are the main post-colonial thinkers, and this is something important where Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay is composing the first novel written in English. In fact, it is the first Indian novel written in English, which is Rajmohan's wife. Jyotirindranath is a very interesting name, the brother of Rabindranath, who translated plays from the French. Now, this is one text that I want to move into. I don't know how much time I have, but Rabindranath Tagore's nationalism is something which we have to go into if we are talking about Indian post-colonialism. And Tagore's nationalism was basically a series of lectures which were delivered rather, in the year 1917. In fact, it was a series of lectures from 1914 to 1917, given in Japan. And Rabindranath over here, very, very interestingly, he is critiquing the very idea of nationalism. If we talk about nationalism, I can talk about this particular text for 2 hours, so I'm just reducing that to a couple of minutes. So basically, Rabindranath is critiquing the very idea of nationalism over here, because he feels that nationalism is a very, very narrow concept. Why is it a narrow concept? Because nationalism puts men into national boundaries. And by doing that, we are made to not to think in broader terms, but we are made to think in very narrow terms, in the sense of national integration, in the sense of national pride and stuff like that. So therefore, if you are an Indian nationalist, it means that you necessarily will have to talk about Indian history, Indian texts, Indian identity, but you will not be allowed to talk about the European history, because an Indian nationalist should never move out of India. And Rabindranath says that this nationalism has been produced by capitalism, because the nation, the modern nation states, are bourgeois capitalist states whose main aim is to accumulate wealth and territorial power. This is what Rabindranath says, that the modern nation states are basically capitalist bourgeois states whose main aim is to accumulate wealth and territorial power. And Rabindranath argues, later on in a book that he writes 2 years before his death, The Crisis of Civilization, he argues over there that, this mindless temptation for wealth, this mindless temptation for territorial expansion has produced people like Hitler, has produced fascism. And, therefore, Rabindranath argues that nationalism is a threat. Far from being a wonderful thing that produces national pride and a sense of the national history, nationalism is actually a threat, because it puts the nation above man. And as a romantic intellectual, to Rabindranath, as a spiritualist, to Rabindranath, man is the most important part of the human cognition, not the nation. And this is where Rabindranath had this debate with Gandhi, and the two fell apart, because Gandhi always felt that the nation comes first and then man. But Rabindranath was always of the point of view that man comes first, then nation. If man does not survive, a nation will never survive. So therefore, this one, the next one, which I have said, The Crisis in Civilization, published in 1939, 2 years before Rabindranath's death. So Rabindranath is constantly arguing for a perfect synergy between the East and the West. And if you have not, then please read a book by Dr. Chinmay Guha, who is an iconic professor in the Department of English of the University of Calcutta. And he has recently brought out a book called The Correspondences Between Rabindranath and Roma Rola. So, those letters are very important in understanding Rabindranath's notion of the post-colonial, And so therefore, Rabindranath is critiquing the very idea of the nation. He is critiquing the very idea of nationalism because he believes that nationalism is basically a bourgeois capitalist enterprise that mainly talks about the accumulation of wealth and territorial expansion, and that ultimately will engage nations in war, and that will ultimately solve nothing. So nationalism as an idea, nationalism as an ideological standpoint is something that Rabindranath is very wary of, and throughout his life, throughout his poetries, through his poems, lectures, essays, even novels like Gora, he has constantly and vehemently opposed the very idea of nationalism. So in the next section we have Raja Rao, and that in Raja Rao talks about the importance of constructing a distinct Indian English, just like the American English, and therefore he says that the novels of India should have a storytelling method. They should have a Sthal Purana kind of a tradition. These are some of the newspapers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These contributed to the post-colonial discourse of resisting the Eurocentric narratives of history. For example, the Bengal Gazette, the Calcutta Gazette, the Digdarshan, these are all produced from Bengal, mind you. So Samachar Darpan, Vande Mataram, which was edited by none other than Sri Aurobindo. You have the Amrita Bazar Patrika and many, many others. All these newspapers played a very important part in constructing the discourse of, in constructing the post-colonial discourse of India. All right, so so let's move into the last ones. So this is, I'm rushing through this. Please forgive me for that. So this is Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, and she has written quite a lot of essays, and she has written quite a lot of books on post-colonial theories. For example, Can the Subaltern Speak, which is of course the most celebrated essay. But I think we should also go through these two, which are a bit less known, but nonetheless very important. A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason. This was published in 1999, and there's a particular essay that she has published in this year, How the Heritage of Post-Colonial Studies Thinks Colonialism Today. And Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's politics has always been to think about the subaltern, right? And she basically theorizes on the very question of subalternity, and how the subalterns are basically people who do not find their voice in the mainstream discourses. That's how simply Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak defines the subaltern as, So therefore, subalterns are basically a group of people or a class of people maybe who do not find their voices in the dominant discourses. So the dominant discourse might be the gender, the dominant discourse might be the colonialism itself, whatever it is. But that's what Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak is basically talking about, Then of course we have Homi Bhabha, who is again a very, very important thinker of our times. He has very interesting ideas. I wish I had a bit more time to talk about these things, so maybe in the next session or whatever. So, he has these issues when he is talking about the things of post-colonial discourse. He has written these books like Nation and Addition and the Location of Culture. Now he has these, issues of the hybridity, mimicry, difference, and ambivalence. I will just explain this in a couple of minutes. So, Homi Bhabha is basically saying that, the post-colonial writings, the post-colonial writings as a space is a hybrid space. It's a hybrid space because in post-colonial discourses, you have the meeting of the colonizers' politics with the politics of the colonized. So therefore, when you're, say, for example, if you're reading Rabindranath's Gora, or if you're reading Rajmohan's Wife by Bankim Chandra, that will be a hybrid space. Because as a literary form, a novel is a Western import, whereas, you know, writers who are using those novels as a form, they would be subverting the form of the novel itself, and they would be using that form in order to reconstruct their politics, in order to represent their politics. So therefore, it is essentially a space of hybridity where the colonizer and the colonized narratives meet. And so therefore, there is a mimicry involved in the post-colonial literatures as well. You know, the colonized trying to mimic the Western forms. And this is done because, as we all know, that the post-colonial thinkers and writers, they're basically educated in the colonial discourses, and they want to move closer to power as well, to write back. So therefore, there is a tendency in them to mimic the Western imports. Then they create a difference. So Chinua Achebe would be creating a difference between the Western novel and the African novel. Or if you read Rabindranath's Gora, it would be very different to the kind of forms that we have in the novels of Dickens, for example. So Rabindranath will be creating a difference between the novel, between the British novel and the novel that he is writing, in order to write back at the empire. And therefore the ambivalence, you know, the ambivalence that exists, you know, as a result of this mimicry and the difference. Dipesh Chakraborty, and again, a very, very important writer, a very important thinker, writing provincializing Europe, and you know, basically, you know, Dipesh Chakraborty, you know, if you read through his essays, especially this book Provincializing Europe, you will see that Dipesh Chakraborty, again, like any other post-colonial, is engaging with the critiquing of the universalization of the Western, or let's say the colonialist discourse. So therefore, Dipesh Chakraborty would argue that these macro narratives that we have today, modernity, capitalism, civilization, these are all Western imports. In fact, Marxism itself is a Western import. Marx was not born in India, right? He was not born in Africa either. He was specifically talking about the oppression of the the structures of oppression imposed by the bourgeois because of their tendency to control the capital. So Marx was responding to a particular historical and economic development of his times, which was the Industrial Revolution. So Marxism itself is Eurocentric. And this is something that Dipesh Chakraborty is basically arguing. So therefore, he's saying that, you know, when we are talking about history, when we are talking about literatures, when we are talking about cultures, we have to be very, very careful about the fact that these macro narratives that we have in our mind about modernity, capitalism, civilization, you know, progress, enlightenment, Marxism, all these things that we have in our mind, they are absolutely Eurocentric. So therefore, when a post-colonial writer is writing something, he or she must be aware of the fact that these Western imports will have to be dislodged and critiqued and questioned before one can truly write a post-colonial narrative. So if you are a Marxist post-colonial like Fanon is, like M. Césaire is, there is a problem over there, according to Dipesh Chakraborty. Because you know, a Marxist post-colonial is basically an oxymoron, because you cannot be a Marxist and a post-colonial at the same time, because Marxism is Eurocentric. You know, so therefore there's a lot of problematizations and complexities in the argument of Dipesh Chakraborty. Very sophisticated he is, and he's basically talking about this need to dislodge the temporal template of the Eurocentric discourses. You know, the temporal templates of the Eurocentric discourses will have to be dislodged before one can truly become post-colonial, for that matter, or neo-colonial, whatever. So it's very interesting in that way. The next one is Amitav Ghosh, and these are the non-fiction that he writes. So I've very consciously avoided his novels. So these are the non-fiction writings that he has. In an Imam, Antique-Land, the Imam and the Indian, the Great Derangement, which is, the last two are basically talking about the climate change. And, I have put in these two over here because you might be thinking, oh, but then he's talking about the climate change. How is he post-colonial over there? Yes, he is post-colonial over there because he is talking about how this entire politics of the climate change and this politics of responding to the climate change is basically controlled by the powerful nations. So when you talk about the carbon emissions and how much should one emit the carbon, etc., all these are decided by the powerful nations, and they decide it according to their own interest. So the Western Europe, the US, China, they get to decide these issues about carbon emissions. Whereas, the African nations, the other developing nations like India and the others, they don't have any chance to express their view on carbon emissions and climate change. They're simply being imposed upon with certain ideas. So that's how it is. The Antique-Land, the Imam and the Indian, they all talk about different issues. The Imam and the Indian, for example, talk about some of the contemporary Indian history. For example, the Imam and the Indian talks about the assassination of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Okay, so these are some of the Indian post-colonial thinkers. Apart from these people, Arjun Appadurai, Rajeshwari Sundarajan, Kumkum Sangri, Gauri Vishwanathan, and the others. Okay, so Shoikanta, if you can just guide me, should I move into the race theories, or should I stop over here and maybe we can invite the questions, whatever you want to.
You can just give an idea. We can
Okay.
extend it by 15 minutes.
Okay, fine. So
you have worked so hard, so we are very curious to know it.
Okay.
And I'm sure the participants are enjoying your lecture. Yeah, please carry.
Yeah, thank you. So therefore, you see, in the last part of my talk, I'm so sorry because I'm really notorious for taking more time than I should. The question that I would like to sort of come to now, maybe in the next 5-10 minutes, I will conclude instead of you looking at the watch repeatedly. So, the question of race is a very important part of our contemporary post-colonial debate. We just saw this, I'm sure all of us remember this, when a particular Black man was killed in America, and the entire America was up in arms, and rightly so. So, the question of race is a very important part of our post-colonial discourses because, the question of race is very typical of the American condition. Why? Because the question of race comes into the question of race comes into the forefront the moment there is an intermixing of races. For example, if you go to Africa, the question of race will not be relevant over there because there are no whites in Africa, except in South Africa. All right. Or if you are in India, the question of race is not that important in India because, we are all racially similar. Of course, if you're not looking at the racial stereotypification of the Northeastern Indians. So the question of race is typical to America because America has an intermixing of the races. And in America, what we have is the complete oppression of the Blacks by the whites. So where did it all begin? It all began with the transatlantic slave trade. And Portugal was perhaps the first country which did the slave trade in 1526. And that you have a particular book by Mungo Park. He writes this that they claim no. So basically, and I'm not going into the quote, but Mungo Park is claiming, in fact, that is the truth, that the Blacks who were transported from Africa and taken over to America, they were basically treated like animals. And if you look at the history of the slave trade, you will see that the blacks in Africa, the Negroes in Africa, they were transported across the Atlantic mainly to be engaged in the sugar plantations of Africa, of America. You know, because America till the 19th century was an agricultural country, a country that that mainly depended on the sugarcane agriculture. Sugarcane growing, that is. So therefore, these African Negroes were transported from Africa literally in chains, not figuratively, literally in chains. They were literally put into chains, put into the ships and transported to America. And they were given no wages, they were given no clothing, they were given no proper food, they were lashed with canes, they were beaten, they were raped, they were killed, they were treated as subhumans. And this continued right down to the 3 decades of the 20th century, because the blacks in America never had the equal rights as compared to the whites. All right. So therefore, the blacks were heavily tortured. So as a result of that, we have the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem is basically a location in New York. And this Harlem Renaissance was a renaissance which resisted the oppression of the blacks by the whites in America. And the Harlem Renaissance artists, you know, the painters, the singers, the writers, the poets, they were all working very hard to resist the white oppression of the blacks. They, basically they demanded that the blacks should have the property rights, the blacks should have the voting rights, the blacks should have the rights of the citizens. In fact, they should not be ghettoized, but they should have a free life in America. That is how they basically envisaged their resistance to the white oppression. So these are some of the important developments during the Harlem Renaissance. So you have the plays, written by Granny Mommy and Simon the Syrian and the others. These are the plays written by Ridgely Torrance, right? Granny Mommy, The Rider of Dreams, Simon the Syrian. These are all the plays written by Ridgely Torrance to talk about the oppression of the blacks. We have Claude Mackay writing that famous sonnet, If We Must Die. Hubert Harrison, he established the first newspaper for the Negro movement. Langston Hughes, perhaps the most well-known name of the Harlem Renaissance, he wrote poems to assert the black rights. And you have these musicians, U.B. Blake, Noble Sissle, Ethel Waters, Louis Armstrong. They established the jazz music, and jazz music was basically the music of protest, protesting the white oppression over the blacks. These are the race theorists who are basically talking about how the blacks have been oppressed in America. So Paul Gilroy, this is one book that you must read, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness. And Paul Gilroy is arguing in this book that Western nationalism has always been white-centric. In fact, the very idea of American nationalism, American nationalism has always centered around the whites. This is what Paul Gilroy is arguing, and Paul Gilroy was one of the first ones to have proposed that America should have a salad bowl, model of nationalism. That is, in a salad, everything is mixed, but everything also has its own unique appearance. So you can understand the corn, the cucumber, the onion. They're all together, but different in their own ways. So that's the kind of model that that America should have. That's what Paul Gilroy was saying, the salad bowl model of nationalism. So that's what he was doing. Stuart Hall, of course, he wrote quite a few books, as you can see in the list. These are not necessarily monographs, but these are also essays. And Stuart Hall is constantly talking about encoding and decoding. The name of an essay that he writes in 1972. And the main contention of Stuart Hall is that the blacks should encode their cultural parameters into the American mainstream. Because if the blacks are not able to encode their cultural parameters into the American mainstream, then they will always remain marginalized. So it is the encoding of the blacks and the decoding of the whites and the white oppression that constitutes the main race theories of Stuart Hall. Bell Hooks, whom we lost some days back. So these are some of the books that she writes, and she also she has the same contention about the race. So if you're looking at the intersectionality, I'm right at the end now, just left with 2 more slides. So this is the intersectionality of postmodernism and post-colonialism. So, there are essays by Bob Mishra, if I'm not wrong, about the intersectionality of postmodernism and post-colonialism and how they can intersect at a point of intellectual and, ideological crossroads. Postmodernism is more Eurocentric, as you can understand. So, so that's what it is. So therefore, he's of the point of view, so that's how we can create an intersectionality between postmodernism and post-colonialism, right? Deconstruction of the center, moving from the global to the local, stress on the micro-narratives, meta-narratives rejected. So the meta-narratives of Eurocentric discourses are rejected, and we should move into the micro-narratives, where we can talk about the non-European spaces. So the last thing is transnationalism a threat to post-colonial politics? Because transnationalism is something which is driven by the global politics, the hegemony of the global economic powers. So transnationalism sometimes looks to erase the local and the unique. So, this is something that I was talking to with my principal, and she said that, all the cities around the world today look the same, because you have the same brands, the same, shopping malls, the same, food stores like the KFC. So therefore, every city around the world look the same. We are losing our local and unique identity because we are moving towards a space of transnationalism. But the problem with transnationalism is that it is again driven by the powerful nations. So transnationalism is almost like capitalism in a new avatar, which is trying to conquest the local and the unique and impose the economic and the cultural models of the more powerful. So are we moving towards that? That is something which is something that we really need to look at. Okay. So with that, the last slide was about a poem, which I'm sort of not going into. So therefore, that's how I conclude my lecture. I hope I have not bored you to death. And thank you very much for giving me so much of time. So Shogabda.
Thank you, Dr. Nilanjan. It's always a pleasure to have an erudite scholar like you. It's always a pleasure to have a voracious reader like you on this platform who encourages us to read more and more. There are a few things that I have jotted down today, which I feel that I will definitely read. What was beautiful about your presentation, and I'm sure the participants will agree to it, is the range through which you took us, the range of not only the writers, but the range of their works. There were works which we are all aware of. We all have read when we were reading post-colonialism, but at the same time, there are also works that you have tried to bring attention to. And I'm sure that after the lecture is over today, the participants will be very, very excited to read some of the works, especially by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's The Latest Essay, and Amitav Ghosh's The Latest Nonfiction, The Nutmeg Curse, which I feel that if somebody has read Gun Island, the fictional part, can get a very good idea of Nutmeg's curse, and the way you have presented the Indian post-colonialism from Bengal perspective. Yes, I agree that it was not completely national, but it was Bengal centric. But we also have to consider the fact that the major events and happenings, because as you said, that Calcutta, the colonialist wanted to project Calcutta as the second London. So most of the events, most of the happenings, and most of their endeavors, their projects were executed, projects physical as well as non-physical. By that, I mean the culture, the academics, were very Calcutta centric. So you have presented it in a very beautiful way, taking us again to the debate of Tagore's nationalism with Gandhi, Tagore's idea of nationalism, Tagore's letters in Japan, and Tagore basically, I feel, is an enigma for me. The more I read, the more the layers are revealed as a writer. So thank you very much for taking us to this cerebral feast. We thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sure the participants have enjoyed it. They have been given their opinions in the chat box. There are few questions they have put. I will just volunteer a few of the questions because of the paucity of time.
Yeah.
And thank you for the energy and enthusiasm with which you have delivered the lecture today, irrespective of the fact that you were very recently infected by COVID. So that speaks a lot about your dedication, professionalism, which we really appreciate and honor. Thank you so much. Now the questions. The first question is by Madhiya Sahin, and she says that, can we say that the concept of racism in India has been rooted from colonialism?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I think yes, because so the colonialist interpretation of race would be that the white is good, black is bad. All right. So therefore, I suppose that from that perspective, the North Indians therefore gets that Eurocentric perspective that the fair ones therefore become become a part of the center, and so the Dravidian race, who are the more blacker ones, and and people like me who are happily quite black. So we are at the margin, and that is produced by the colonial interface of racial superiority. So I think, and obviously not to forget that how the northeasterners, especially the people of the Mongoloid race, how they have been racially stereotyped in India as well. And I guess all Indian boys would like to have women of fair color. In fact, if you go by the advertisements in the newspapers, that's how we look at the things. So yes, we are quite racial in that way, and Indians are indeed quite racial, because we think about the Africans as uncultured people, don't we? So therefore, yes, I think indeed the question of race is perpetrated by the colonial discourse. Absolutely.
Thank you. The next question is by Pallavi Chakraborty, and she says that, do you think globalization is a project of neocolonialism, for it attempts at erasure of diverse cultures by giving birth to a homogeneous one?
Absolutely. So therefore, the main politics of globalization, as I understand it, even though I am not really an expert on that field, but I do feel that globalization is indeed, is an attempt at homogeneity. And this attempt at homogeneity is perpetrated by the nations which are powerful, the G8 nations, as we call them, right? So we have, for example, we have these, eateries of Chinese food all across the world. I love Chinese. I have nothing against that. But the point is that, what about, food from those parts of the world which are not a part of the G8 nations? So how many eateries do we have of African food, for example? So therefore, the kind of dresses that we wear, the kind of food that we eat, the kind of literatures we are reading, they're all perpetrated by this model of globalization. And globalization, therefore, unfortunately, is indeed a narrative which is moving towards homogeneity, and that I believe is quite unfortunate. Yes.
Thank you. The next question is a common question, but we'd like to get your ideas on it, your views, in very short way, because
Yeah.
it's a very lengthy question. What are basically the challenges and limitations as per your understanding of post-colonial theory?
Well, limitations would be that post-colonial politics can at times be counter-binaried. That is, colonial discourse is Europe is good, non-Europe is bad. Post-colonial politics is okay. So I'm saying just the opposite. Europe is bad, non-Europe is good. This kind of a tendency to move towards a neat binary is perhaps a limitation in some of the post-colonials, which Chinua Achebe has guarded against in many of his essays. Amitav Ghosh, Nilanjan Chakraborty, they have all guarded against this tendency to create a counter binary, because that really does not solve the problem. It only creates another problem. So I think that limitation is something that we need to be aware of while we are studying post-colonialism.
Thank you. The next question is by Angana Bose, and she says that are neo-colonial agents like mass media and OTT constructive, or do they create lumpen bourgeois offering transnational content to its audience?
There is no neat answers to this. I mean, as much as we would like to believe that the mainstream media is indeed quite capitalist and very bourgeois, the Goswamis of the world are indeed quite capitalist, and you all know that very well. But the thing is that, but they have a role to play as well, isn't it? The OTT platforms, internet, I believe, is a very interesting part of our study, because internet has a democratic appeal and a democratic, capacity, which mainstream media do not have. So if I want to say, for example, tell my story, the Goswamis of the world will not air my story. So I take into vlogging, I take into microblogging, I go to Facebook and the others and tell my story. Just for example, last night when we had this terrible train accident, people were posting that we need blood. So therefore, you see, the OTTs, the alternative media, the social media, they play a very important part in creating a democratic structure, whereby the people who do not have a chance to otherwise become, otherwise do not have the chance to be heard, they are getting themselves heard. Filmmakers, for example, are uploading their films on the social media. Which will never get a theatrical release. So I think actually the internet is subversive, but we of course need to know how to use it. That of course is also very important.
Right. Thank you. We will like to conclude with the last question.
Yeah.
That is by Binay Kumar Singh, and the question is: isn't it ironical and hypocritical that most of the post-colonial writers talk of decolonization on one hand, and most of the post-colonial writers are based in the Western countries on the other hand? What's your take on that?
That's what I said, that most of the post-colonial writers and thinkers are product of the Western education. So that is a very problematic political stance that they have. But that doesn't mean that the native writers are not producing post-colonial politics. But the problem is that, yes, that I must say is a problem, that the Western educated post-colonials do get more attention than the more native ones who are writing in the native language. So I think that is where we need to be a bit more expansive and look into them a bit more. So yes, those of you who are doing your MPhil and PhDs can look into them, no problem.
Right. So with that, we come to the conclusion of today's session. I'm sure that has been very, very interactive second part of the session as well, followed which was obviously the second part. The first part was the lecture we thoroughly enjoyed, and Shreya ma'am sends a word that she, however, could not join today because she's on her way home. Right. And I would like to, on her behalf, give the word of thanks to you, Dr. Nilanjan Chakraborty, for taking out so much of time preparing and and preparing this lecture, making it so interesting, so informative, and so expansive in the sense of the research that has been put into, and the way it has been presented to us. There has been a lot of new areas that the researchers can look into, as is the aim and objective of this particular lecture series. I would like to thank all the participants who are a constant support. It is because of the participants that we are able to hold such lecture series. And on my personal note, I would like to thank the woman behind the idea of this lecture series, that is our own Shreya Bhattacharya ma'am, who created this idea, who executed it very successful way. The testimony to the fact is this is the second season, you can say, of this lecture series. So with those words, thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Nilanjan, once again. See you tomorrow again, all of you, at 2 o'clock. Thank you so much. Please do take care. Good night.
Thank you.